now. Joining us from Athens today, Greece, is the Squawk newsmaker of the hour. You bring us some great shots, Steve. That's a beauty. That looks very familiar up there. That structure looks a little run down. Looks like they've neglected some infrastructure over there as well in Greece, I think. But welcome this morning. That's a great shot of the Parthenon and the Acropolis.
That's the home of home of democracy, the Acropolis and the Parthenon. So I'm here. Just finished debating Bernard-Henri Levy on globalism versus nationalism here in Athens.
Who won?
You'll have to ask the New York Times. They sponsored it. I'll let the judges call it.
Yeah,
I feel pretty good though.
Yeah, we'll get a fair answer there. No, we would. So I don't know what you think about the latest developments. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin was smiling, no teeth, but smiling yesterday. Everybody seemed to be getting along pretty well. We've started calling this, what may come out of this, a skinny deal. Is that what you expect, and is that something that we should have probably expected all along, and not what you would have done? Is it a half measure? Should we have stayed longer at the table to get more out of this?
Well, look, Joe, I think this shows the power of President Trump's program and his negotiating position. I mean, the fact that, you've had early in the week all these announcements about increased agriculture purchases, increased purchases. I think you had something on the CNBC site earlier this morning about potential financial services opening up in China. And you just had, I think, a guest on the previous segment, Mr. Khan, about the strength of American manufacturing, American economy. So, President Trump, his policies and his negotiating position have worked. Remember, the key here is the state-owned industries and the forced technology transfers, the bigger overall deal to restructure their economy. That was this May transaction that Lighthizer and Vice Premier Li He negotiated. China is hurting so much by these tariffs, and what they're trying to do is anything possible to get President Trump, I think, to delay or either nullify the October tariffs. So I wouldn't be surprised today if you saw some interim deal, as I've been talking about. They might do some interim deal, but President Trump's very focused, I think, on the overall deal that starts to bring the supply chain back to the United States. So this will be, I think, inextricably linked to something bigger and more powerful. But, he's up against the cheerleading section of Wall Street and the Chinese that have been, for the last 3 weeks signaling this. But I believe this shows the strength of his negotiating position. And so if we see something today, it's on the smaller side. I think it's leading overall to a larger transaction. Clearly, the hawks and the super hawks want to see the entire deal and want to see that supply chain coming back. And I think you saw President Trump last night in Minnesota. His focus is to bring high value-added manufacturing jobs back to the United States.
Steve, though, speak to this. There's a concern that if you take a small deal now, it actually will give the Chinese leverage, that it actually won't give the President Trump, that is, more leverage to actually get to the bigger deal.
Yeah, I think that if you see, particularly the way that he deals with these tariffs in October, I think you'll see where his negotiating leverage is. Remember, Trump's a master of knowing how to use negotiating leverage. So I think that this deal will clearly have springs to it or sets to it. If there is a deal, that will lead us to go back. If there's any recalcitrance or any slow walking, remember the two key things are the subsidies, the state-owned industries, and the forced technology transfers. That's the beating heart of this kind of reorganization of the Chinese economy, this integration into the world economy, and what will start to lead supply chains back to the industrial democracies, including the United States. It's one of the reasons USMCA, which really needs to get passed, is so important. It's part of this whole overall trade package that President Trump's been working on. So remember, the devil's going to be in the details here. But this, once again, I think shows you it's the Chinese that are coming and offering all types of opportunities, all types of give-ups to get the tariffs off him. He was right from the beginning. The tariffs have forced him to the negotiating table. This is what the Wall Street cheerleading section has forgotten. It's the tariffs that have forced the Chinese to the table. So I think you'll see in the details where if there is something announced today where President Trump will leave himself plenty of room to go back, if there's any backsliding or any lack of focus on trying to get the overall Lighthizer deal eventually done.
Hey, Steve, I think you're going to agree with this op-ed. This was an op-ed in the New York Times just yesterday. We were talking about it's a quote that I think almost you could have written. He says, a darker truth is now dawning on the world. China's economic miracle hasn't just failed to liberate Chinese people, and this is the part I'm curious whether you'll agree with, it is now also routinely corrupting the rest of us outside of China. This column referring, I think, to freedom of speech issues related to the NBA. What's your take on that?
You know, we've talked about this many times on the show over the last 6 months. This is the whole, what President Trump's been laying out, and what really, quite frankly, what the hawks and groups like the Committee on the Present Danger have been talking about. The CCP and the kind of globalists in the party of Davos have infected the entire global system. And really, you've seen that this week in the NBA fiasco. What was really shocking is ESPN last night put up the map of China and included the 7 dots. It included this highly controversial area in the South China Sea that the Chinese just take for their own sovereignty, away from the nations of the world and away from international law. It's stunning to me how they've corrupted corporate America and really corporations around the world. But this is what people have been saying, and I think now you're seeing it. So whoever wrote that, yes, I 100% agree with it. Quite frankly, wish I'd written it myself.
Steve, what's the alternative? I mean, you look at so many multinational companies, U.S. companies that do a lot of business there, but also have supply chains there. And Apple obviously comes top of mind. They've done things like when they report their sales, they report sales for Greater China, which includes Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is the way the Chinese like to have these things done. They've taken apps off of different situations. But these are companies that say they are operating under the laws of the nations that they are serving, and that they while they are trying to promote democracy and their way of thinking, freedom of speech, that they can't exactly do things that country considers to be illegal. Is the alternative that you can only operate in your own country?
No, the thing is, there are certain rules that you ought to that you ought to be able as a company to abide by. In China, which is really, with the Uyghur situation, with the organ harvesting, the suppression of the Chinese people. Remember, the Chinese workforce is basically a slave labor workforce. That's what the people in the hawks on the right and President Trump's even been saying, that the slave labor force is really making goods for the unemployed and underemployed in the industrial democracies. That's the tragedy of what this Frankenstein monster that the City of London, Wall Street, and the giant corporations have allowed to be built. You have to stand for something more than the bottom line. Remember, in the great period of American capitalism, our company stood for something more than just the bottom line. They stood for basic American values and basic values of the West. Look, I'm here in the home of democracy, right? A mile from the Parthenon. We were bequeathed this. And companies like Apple and these companies have to stand up. And this is not just some marginal thing. Yes, every country is going to have certain things that you have to abide by in their business code. But these are fundamental about human rights. Look at the streets of Hong Kong. We've talked about this, guys, now since June 9th. Look at that's the fight for capitalism. That's English common law and Chinese tenacity has built Hong Kong.
But then,
and
Steve,
look at what's happening in those streets. Look at the kids who are fighting.
What do you say to every American company doing business in Saudi Arabia or any other country?
Or Russia.
Or Russia.
China.
Or, I mean, you could go down the list. What's the answer then?
Look, I don't think you see, there's clearly not in Saudi Arabia or Russia what you see in China. Okay, you don't see what they're doing to the Uyghurs. You don't see what they're doing to the Tibetan Buddhists and the Dalai Lama. You don't see what they're doing to the house Christians in the underground Catholic Church. You don't see the human harvesting of organs. The Chinese Communist Party, this is not the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party are suppressed by these people. Clearly, the monarchies in the Gulf and Russia have certain problems, and I think America is trying to address those problems. Trying to address those problems clearly with our allies in the Middle East, and certainly you're seeing a liberalization starting there. In Russia, we've got to confront what the kleptocracy is doing there, but you can't compare any of those to what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. And finally, people are stepping up to it. Corporate America is getting smash meth now by the CCP for what are just small outside their lanes. And you see that these people are dropping the hammer on them. I think this is a lesson for every American exactly how the Chinese Communist Party treats their own people.
Hey, Steve, I don't want to take anything away from what they're doing to the Uyghurs. That's 1.5 million people that they've put in re-education camps, and they're holding back. Nothing from that at all. But if you look at places like Saudi Arabia, women for a long time have not had any sort of freedoms. And you're right, things are opening up in different places. But again, I just want to say it's really tricky to try and operate.
Yes, I agree. I agree with you. I agree with you. Look, the women, and you've seen with MBS, with all his faults, you're starting to see they're getting driver's license, and nobody supports the suppression. That nobody supports the suppression of really the Christians in Saudi Arabia. But you can't compare that to the Uyghurs. These are not re-education camps. These are concentration camps. OK, and we finally put sanctions on the companies that are doing it. You've seen what they've done with the organ harvesting. You've seen what they've done to the Tibetan Buddhists and the Dalai Lama, the underground Christian church and their own people. You cannot compare the Gulf Emirates. You can't compare Russia with all of their faults. You can't compare those with what the Chinese Communist Party has done to its own people, and you see that in the streets of Hong Kong every day.
Unfortunately, Steve, the NBA situation really drove home the market opportunity in China, which is, the elephant in the room, that it's going to be hard, to go after your own interests. And a clean divorce from China we've got 500 million basketball fans, NBA fans. In China, we got 300 million people in the whole United States. So that drove home to me the type of market potential there is for everything in China. And that's why for 25 years, we've sort of been able to look away, because we're getting all this cheap stuff from Walmart, and inflation stays low. I don't see how you have a full divorce from a market opportunity like that, Steve. I know that it's about profits and money.
I can see how you have a decoupling. We're going down to decoupling right now. It's the Chinese that are in Washington, D.C. to try to present President Trump with at least an interim step, because they know the path he's going down is a decoupling. They're petrified about that in Beijing, and they see that the West can actually do that. Will there be some disruptions? Absolutely. Be some perturbations? Absolutely. But believe me, the industrial democracies in India, in Japan, South Korea, the supply chains can all come back home, all of it, to Western Europe. And that's why the USMCA is so important. You can actually see this happening. Companies are going to have to understand the CCP is a totalitarian dictatorship, and they're seeing this. If they want to be in business with that, then let their shareholders and let their board of directors bear the fiduciary responsibility of that. Let history guide them. But I will tell you, if we take a hard line here, you're going to see massive changes in China. You're going to see massive changes. The freedom of the Chinese people is going to be the greatest story of the first half of the 21st century. And one of the people that have driven that, with all the grief he gets, is Donald Trump. And I think you're going to see today what the Chinese are prepared to do to get away from his tariffs, because they want those October 15 tariffs either pushed back or removed.
So last time you were on, I think just to switch gears, just for the final part of the interview, you were talking about some of the toss-up states and that it was going to be tough. But I think in the backdrop, we were thinking about Biden, or he was the presumptive front runner then. I don't know whether it's changed with everything we've seen, all the other stuff in the past 2 weeks. But how would an Elizabeth Warren presidency, what does China think of Elizabeth Warren? And what do you think of her chances if she did become the nominee?
Well, it's interesting, she's just coming out with now the series of white papers. She's actually trying to get to the right of President Trump, except for her not fully understanding the tariffs. If you look at Elizabeth Warren, you look at some of the Democrats, they're trying to get to the right of President Trump on China. One of the reasons they understand that Biden is compromised by China. They understand in the upper Midwest in these primaries, they've got a real opportunity to blow Joe Biden out of the water, because Joe Biden is totally compromised. His family's compromised, and he's compromised with his history during the Obama administration, particularly about the South China Sea and other issues. That's why I said, and I think I've said this from the beginning, is that Elizabeth Warren is going to have a centrist challenger. That will either be Michael Bloomberg, or I think I said on your show, Hillary Clinton. I think Clinton and Bloomberg are looking, as Biden starts to collapse, and I think Biden's collapse is pretty intimate by November, December. I think you're going to see a centrist challenge Elizabeth Warren, and we'll see how that plays out. But I think the Democrats, in the wanting to replace Donald Trump, understand that Elizabeth Warren and some of the populists have been so driven to the left, particularly some of her things about capitalism, some of her things about these asset taxes. They've been so driven to the left that a centrist is going to have a real opportunity here. And I don't discount at all that you may see an Ali Frazier, rematch in Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Right. Steve, what's your political calculus on potential impeachment of President Trump and what that does, both in terms of the election and even potentially these trade talks with China, especially given the indictment yesterday of these two associates of Rudy Giuliani?
Look, Chris Ruddy is a friend of the president's, and what Chris said the other night I think it was on NBC, when he said the other night that he thinks that this impeachment is a moral threat to Trump's presidency. I believe that's true. And I think that the president's got the whole burden of everything right now on his shoulders, of defending himself on impeachment, negotiating with China, dealing with the situation in the Middle East with the Kurds. You know, the staff at the White House has to step up. Somebody's got to step up and understand that if you look at the polling right now, the narrative's going in the wrong direction. I mean, President Trump, I think, has galvanized his base. His actions galvanize his base, particularly in things like trade, the wall, and getting out of these endless foreign wars. The battle is going to be in those 40 districts the Democrats run, and particularly the 26 that went to President Trump in 2016. I think a focus has to be on that. I think Nancy Pelosi understands there's no one thing, as I've said before, no one smoking gun, but it's this process. She's going to have to wear down President Trump. Look, he's a fighter, and he's a great counterpuncher. So we're going to see in the coming days a week. But other people, it's a team effort, and other people are going to have to step up to get this narrative right. The president of the United States can't do everything. He can't negotiate every deal. He can't be the communications director. He can't be the head of his legal. He can't be the head of messaging. He can't negotiate with Congress, and particularly with the geopolitical situation in China, in the Middle East, in NATO. Somebody's going to have to step up and really help the president here. I think if he gets the help that he's needed by the White House staff, you got a lot of competent people in there. You got a lot of great people. If people step up and do this, and he adds some people to his legal team, and particularly since Rudy's had these, and I love Rudy Giuliani, but he's had these issues in the last 24, 48 hours, you may need to restaff the legal team also.
Do any of the allegations against the president or Rudy Giuliani disturb you at all?
The president, no. I think the president is I think it's a normal course of business. I think those are questionable by a lot of people. I clearly don't think they rise to a level of impeachability, at least what we know now. But that's not the point. Nancy Pelosi knows she's got the votes. She's going to bring two articles of impeachment, and they're going to vote on them. This is just all a show. This is like a Moscow show trial. So that process is going to go on, but that's the political reality. Remember, this is not legal. The entire thing, and I love Rudy, but some of this messaging, even you saw on Laura Ingraham and other shows, where he really starts talking about these investigations he's doing and what's going on. There's a process in the House Intelligence Committee. Much of this information is known, and this information was in these 40 subpoenas that were given to Rosenstein. This is what I said on Trish Reagan the other night, is just let all that information ought to come out. The American people ought to see all of that. And I think that's why Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are holding off a vote in the House, because they don't want any possibility of due process. They don't want the president to be able to get his side out. So I think the American people are going to have the highest part of political drama over the next 6 to 8 weeks. And really, I think not just Trump's presidency, but really the direction of the country, and particularly China, who is watching this very closely. They believe that Trump's getting weakened by impeachment. But I think that President Trump thinks he actually may be strengthened by this process.
So before we let you go, Steve, you mentioned the possibility of an Ollie Frazier rematch. What at this point in time, what do you think the chances are that Hillary Clinton is going to jump into this in 2020? Do you think it's 30%, 10%?
As Joe Biden implodes, and I think that when I define implosion as when he drops out of #1 in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, when he goes below that, not national polls, when he goes below that, I think you're going to. Elizabeth Warren is going to have a centrist challenger. Kamala Harris and other people haven't been able to step up. If it takes Hillary Clinton, or if it takes even Michael Bloomberg, she's going to have a centrist challenger. That's going to be a real primary. So I think as you see Biden go down, I believe it could be a high probability that Hillary Clinton may be the first in to challenge her. I don't think that centrist Democrats and the Wall Street faction that controls that aspect of the Democratic Party are prepared to just give the nomination to Elizabeth Warren now that Bernie Sanders has had his health issues, and Joe Biden is between being compromised by China and also just how weak his campaign is, his fundraising. I don't think they're prepared to turn it over to Elizabeth Warren, particularly the fact that she's so far radicalized on so many policies they think may turn off people in the upper Midwest. So I think she'll have a centrist challenger. I think that challenger is going to be Hillary Clinton.